In 1870, 60 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. By 1895, fewer than 300 remained. This is how an empire starved a continent into submission. Before the killing began, the buffalo were everywhere. A Comanche hunter named Quanah Parker could ride for days across the Texas Panhandle and see nothing but brown bodies stretching to the horizon. 60 million animals, maybe more. No one had counted them precisely. They didn't need to. The buffalo were not a resource to be managed. They were the ground itself, the moving earth that Plains nations had organized their entire existence around for at least 2,000 years. A Lakota family in 1860 needed perhaps 20 buffalo per year to survive. A single animal provided everything: meat for winter storage, hides for tipis and clothing, bones for tools and weapons, sinews for thread, hooves for glue, even dung for fuel on the treeless plains. A woman named Pretty Shield, born Crow around 1858, would later describe how her people moved with the herds in seasonal patterns so old they had become sacred. Summer hunts, winter camps, spring migrations. The rhythm was not chaotic. It was a calendar written in muscle and blood. This was not subsistence. This was abundance. Buffalo provided surplus. Trade networks carried hides and pemmican, dried meat and fat, across thousands of miles, to the Spanish in New Mexico, to French traders on the Missouri River, to other tribes. A healthy herd meant a healthy nation. It meant children could eat. It meant warriors had time to make war, artists had time to make art, elders had time to teach. It meant sovereignty, the freedom to move, to hunt, to decide. By 1870, that world still existed in living memory and present practice. The reservation system was only beginning. The railroads had barely crossed the plains. The great herds still darkened the grass. And yet the machinery of their extinction was already in motion, not as accident, but as deliberate policy written in official letters and carried out by men with rifles. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty promised the Lakota the Black Hills and the hunting grounds of the Powder River Basin. The ink was barely dry. Within months, railroad surveys cut through the grasslands. Within years, the great herds began to fragment. This was not coincidence. It was infrastructure. General Philip Sheridan understood the mathematics of power. Kill the buffalo, he reasoned, and you kill the resistance. In 1875, he testified before Congress. The hide hunters were doing more to defeat the Indians than the entire U.S. Army. He was not criticizing them. He was praising them. By then, commercial hunters like Frank Mayer and Charlie Rath were already shipping hides east by the railcar, 200,000 in a single season from Kansas alone. The animals were left to rot. The mate was waste. The objective was extinction. The U.S. military saw opportunity in chaos. Officers issued permits to hide hunters on the Great Plains. Some commanders provided ammunition. The War Department watched the numbers collapse with satisfaction. Colonel Richard Irving Dodge estimated that 3.5 million buffalo died between 1872 and 1874. Other historians place the total kill at 50 million across the entire slaughter period. The record is disputed on exact counts. What is not disputed, the speed was deliberate. Buffalo were the keystone. Remove them, and the entire arch of Plains life would tumble. The tipi economy depended on them. The trade networks depended on them. The spiritual calendars turned with the migrations. By 1883, fewer than 500 buffalo remained in the wild. A culture that had sustained itself for millennia through intimate knowledge of these animals now faced a landscape emptied of its reason for existing. But the decision-makers in Washington and the generals in their field forts had not simply wanted the buffalo dead. They had wanted something else to happen after. Between 1870 and 1895, the buffalo did not disappear by accident. They were hunted to extinction as deliberate policy, a calculated campaign to collapse the economic and spiritual foundation of Plains Indian nations. In 1874, hide hunters descended on the southern plains. The Sharp's rifle, accurate at 600 yards, made industrial slaughter possible. A skilled hunter could kill 100 buffalo a day. The hides sold for $3 each in Kansas City. By 1875, the southern herd was functionally extinct. Fewer than 1,000 remained where millions had grazed. The northern plains held out longer. But by 1883, when the last commercial herd was killed near the Missouri River in Montana, fewer than 300 wild buffalo survived on the continent. In a single decade, the population had collapsed from tens of millions to near total annihilation. The U.S. military understood exactly what this meant. General Philip Sheridan explicitly advocated buffalo extermination as a war strategy. His officers reported to Washington that destroying the herds would make the tribes dependent on government rations, and therefore controllable. Colonel Richard Irving Dodge later recalled openly, "The buffalo's destruction was the most effective weapon we could use against the Indians." The tribes watched the herds vanish. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Blackfeet, nations whose entire material and spiritual life turned on the buffalo cycle, saw their economy disintegrate in real time. Hunting parties returned with nothing. Winter stores could not be built. The nomadic camps that had moved with the seasonal migration had nowhere to move to. By the 1890s, starvation was not a consequence of buffalo extinction. It was the intended result, and the government knew precisely what came next. Desperate, starving nations had no choice but to accept confinement on reservations, to surrender their land, and to submit to federal control. The buffalo vanishing and Indian confinement were not separate events. They were one policy unfolding in sequence. By 1900, the Great Plains were silent in a way they had never been silent before. The buffalo were gone, nearly all of them. What remained was absence itself. 60 million animals reduced to perhaps 300, scattered in zoos, private ranches, and a handful of protected preserves. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, and dozens of other nations faced not just starvation, but erasure. Their economies had no currency. Their spiritual calendars had no meaning. Their children were being sent to boarding schools, Carlisle Indian Industrial Training School in Pennsylvania, the Kemawa Indian School in Oregon, where they were forbidden to speak their languages, forbidden to practice their religions, forbidden to remember who they had been when the buffalo lived. The U.S. government distributed rations of beef and commodity foods instead. Inadequate, humiliating, designed to make survival conditional on dependency. Reservation life became a kind of managed poverty, enforced by the Indian Bureau and the military posts that ringed the reservations: Fort Laramie, Fort Sill, Fort Davis. Some tribes tried to explain the catastrophe through their own frameworks. Had they broken a covenant with the animals? Had the spirits withdrawn their gifts? Others understood it exactly as it was, an act of war, a strategy of subjugation executed by the U.S. Army and civilian hunters working in concert. Yet the extinction was incomplete, and that incomplete extinction would create a contradiction the government had not foreseen. Private ranchers like Charles Goodnight in Texas and Mitchell Pablo on the Flathead Reservation in Montana were breeding buffalo for profit and prestige. The American Bison Society, founded in 1905, began buying and protecting herds. The Bronx Zoo maintained a breeding program. These buffalo survived not because anyone cared about indigenous cultures, but because wealthy Americans wanted to preserve a piece of the vanishing West, a trophy, a symbol, a managed memory. By 1910, the captive herds numbered in the thousands. The wild herds remained extinct. But in those captive animals, a question was forming: could the buffalo ever come home? The question went unanswered for nearly a century. What remained of buffalo culture after 1895 was not a living tradition, but an archive of absence: photographs, ledger drawings, museum collections, and the memory held in tribal oral histories that the U.S. government had tried to erase. In 1905, the American Bison Society formed to prevent complete extinction, establishing herds at the Bronx Zoo and on private ranches. By 1913, the National Bison Range opened in Montana, managed by the federal government that had orchestrated the slaughter. These were conservation efforts, but not restitution. The animals survived. The culture did not. In 1939, the Blackfeet Nation received a gift of 18 buffalo from the National Bison Range, the first return of the animal to a Plains tribe in over 40 years. They were grateful. They were also symbolic. Real sovereignty would have meant controlling the hunt, deciding the herd size, determining the spiritual protocols of the kill. Instead, tribes managed small captive populations under federal oversight, hunting by permit on their own lands. The buffalo had become a resource managed by the colonizers' bureaucracy, not the sustaining commons of a free people. By 2024, fewer than 31,000 buffalo exist on tribal lands across North America, a recovery measured in thousands, not millions. Each one descended from those few hundred survivors, their genetic diversity permanently narrowed. The question the 20th century inherited, could the buffalo come home, was answered partially, conditionally, too late. But a different question emerged among younger tribal members and land stewards, one that would reshape the entire conversation about what restoration could mean. The buffalo extinction was not nature's tragedy, it was policy, executed with precision across a generation. Another file is already open: the forced removal of 60,000 Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. If this history matters to you, subscribe to the archive.